Hey, hello. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dr. Mark Bennett, the Research Manager at the Royal Armouries, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to the sixth talk in our winter lecture series. The Royal Armoury is the UK's national collection of arms and armour. Although our main museum in Leeds remains closed, our locations at Fort Nelson and the Tower of London are once again open for visitors. The tower in particular looks a lot better than it did in the winter of 1861-2, when an officer stationed there recorded how the ice that formed on the River Thames afforded a convenient asylum for the dead cats and other refuse that drifted upon it from the neighbourhood of the adjoining wharves. Dead cats and other refuse, of course, form some of the unconventional weapons that we see used in today's talk. This event is brought to us by the Causes and Consequences of Electoral Violence project, a 3-year study into 19th century elections funded jointly by the ESRC and AHRC research councils. If you haven't done so already, please do take the first half of their short survey by following the link tinyurl.com/ev-survey-1 posted in the chat and given in the opening slides. You still have time while I make the introductions. The survey is really important for the project and every response counts. However, by completing both halves and providing your email address, you'll be eligible to win £20 worth of books from the museum gift shop. If you're watching again, you can still participate. The survey will remain open until this video is taken down on Monday. Just make sure to pause the video and take the first half of the survey before you watch the rest of the lecture. As always, there'll be a question and answer session after the talk. If you're watching on YouTube, please type your question in the chat box at the right-hand side of your screen. If you're watching via Zoom, you'll find a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can type questions. As always, while I can't guarantee to get through them all, I'll cover as many as I can. We're also going to be experimenting with a few informal polls during the talk. Now, unfortunately, these are Zoom only, but the people on YouTube can participate by either thinking of their answer or posting in the chat, and you'll secure bragging rights if you happen to be right. So with the necessary preparation out of the way, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Patrick Kuhn. Patrick is the principal investigator on the Causes and Consequences of Electoral Violence project, which brings together his research interests in big data and electoral violence. His research has an explicitly comparative dimension, with his work ranging from Kenya and Pakistan to Germany and now England and Wales. The current project draws on a range of contemporary sources to construct a database of electoral violence in the 19th century, which provides a wealth of insights about the political culture of the time and forms the basis of today's talk. Without any further ado then, Patrick Kuhn.
Good. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Mark. I hope everybody can hear me. Is that okay, Mark?
Yeah, coming through loud and clear.
Thank you very much. Good. It's my pleasure to introduce this project and to share with you some of the initial findings of the project, which is now roughly 2.5 years old. And will be going on until the next summer. This is a project together with my colleagues at Durham University, Dr. Kuhn, Professor Nick Vivian, and Gary Hutchinson, who is the postdoctoral research associate on the project. Later on in the Q&A, we will also have Lydia Buckroyd with us, who has worked explicitly on the deaths associated with election violence, and will be able to answer questions on that front. So starting right, have a look at this scene. You can see that there is a gentleman raising the stick and trying to hit another person, while behind him, a gentleman is punching another one in the face. Over on the bridge, 2 people are throwing someone over the bridge. What might have caused this carnage? The answer is hidden in the back of the image behind the horse's head with a placard indicating vote. This is an image of the election riot in Hawick in the Scottish borders of 1837, where a mob of Liberal supporters attacked Conservative voters and authorities refused the conservative voters protection. The mob stripped 11 voters of their clothes and threw them in the river, which then had to run through town with barely a rag able to cover them. The conservative voters went to their headquarters, which is in the Tower Inn, which the mob besieged, throwing stones and breaking over 276 panes of glass. This seemed to work. The Liberal candidate in the constituency won the election with a slim majority of just 44 votes. Now, while this seems extreme and entertaining, the question we had at the beginning was how frequent this type of behavior is. Is it really widespread? Is this something typical to the 19th century? What are the different forms of election violence that it took, and what are the weapons that were used? And more importantly, when and how did elections become this mostly peaceable affair that we have today? So in the talk, I will cover these 3 points, going over the different types of election violence that we identify in our data set and how widespread it actually is. However, before I go into this, a primer might be needed on 19th century elections and 19th century politics, just so that everyone can follow the basics. So the 19th century was a really turbulent time. Industrialization creates massive economic and social changes, which led to new political demands. Throughout the century, starting in 1832, the beginning of the period we are looking at, we have the first extension of the franchise due to the Great Reform Act. This extended the franchise a little, but most importantly got rid of a bunch of rotten boroughs and made elections much more competitive. The Second Reform Act followed in 1867, which further expanded the electorate. And then finally, the Third Reform Act in 1884, which granted the right to vote to about 60% of all male voters and no female voters. The electoral system over this time also changed. While the electoral system at the beginning, from between 1832 and 1884, consisted mostly of double-member districts where people could vote for the number of seats. So in a district with 2 seats, you had 2 votes, which you could either give to 2 different candidates or forgive 1 vote and only vote for 1 candidate. This led to an interesting electoral dynamic. Elections at the time were also held in the open. Voting was public. Voters had to go on stage, publicly declare for whom they had voted, and this was recorded in the poll book, and poll books were later publicly available. Only after the Ballot Act in 1872 do we find closed ballot elections where voters went into a booth, cast their vote in secret, and dropped it into a ballot box as we nowadays do. The 2 main political parties at the time were the Liberals and the Conservatives, although later in the period you have Irish parties showing up and the emergence of the Labour Party. The Liberals were mostly the party of the industrial centres and of the Methodist Church, while the Conservatives were primarily the party of the agrarian, the landed elites, and the Church of England. Corruption throughout the 19th century was pervasive, and this had a variety of reasons. First, it was a tradition from the Elizabethan age that there was gift giving, and so corruption was just an extension of that tradition. On the other hand, there was a system that required candidates to fund all of the election proceedings. Candidates were responsible for not only their campaign, but also for funding the building of the hustings, the shed that you see in the image here, on which the election proceedings took place and voters voted, to printing and writing the poll books, etc. So they had to bear a certain amount of the procedural costs that nowadays the state would bear. Moreover, being able to fund these elections and share and campaign with money was seen as a sign of independence and of the candidate's interest to represent and sustain his interest in representing the constituency. Election violence is generally seen as part of corruption. And while most of the literature has focused on bribery, it so far has not been given the proper treatment in the historical literature compared to the use of money and bribes. So we set out at the beginning of this project to create a systematic database of all election violence events between 1832 and 1914, which covers 20 general elections. Creating such a database has only recently become possible due to the massive digitization efforts by the British Library of their newspaper collection. The main sources we have used to build this database are national, regional, and local newspapers, roughly 600 different titles over the period, and parliamentary committee and royal commission reports. This was a massive data collection effort. Using a machine learning classifier, we have searched over 30 million articles to identify roughly the 18,000 relevant articles, which upon reading and coding them separately and individually led us to have about 20,000 event reports. This effort took over 2.5 years, about 50 research assistants from various universities in England, mostly within the Northeast, and over 6,000 hours of coding. In total, the 20,000 event reports boiled down to 2,915 distinct election violent events across the 20 general elections in this period. So we're coming to our first poll, and what we would like to do is ask you what you think the trend of election violence looks like over this period. Here you see 4 different graphs, a graph A, B, C, and D. The x-axis denotes time, and the y-axis the frequency. The 3 vertical lines denote the different Reform Acts. So the first Reform Act in 1832, the second Reform Act in 1867, and the third Reform Act in 1884. Graph A suggests that election violence was most frequent early on in the period and then declined with each Reform Act. Graph B suggests that there is an inverse relationship in the sense that it increases with the second Reform Act, stays fairly high between the second and third Reform Act, and drops. Graph C suggests that election violence was quite frequent throughout the period up until the third Reform Act and the extension of the franchise to 60% of all male voters, and then dropped rapidly thereafter. And finally, Graph D suggests that it was fairly high in 1832, but dropped due to the reform, increased again with the second Reform Act, and then dropped after the third Reform Act. You should now, if you are on Zoom, see in your screen a poll. If I could ask you all to click on one of the answers and click submit, then we can see what the majority of the audience thinks the right data pattern looks like. I'll give you all 5 seconds to make a choice. Good, thank you. Can we close the poll and reveal the result, please? Good, most people think it is C. So 46% people think that election violence was quite high and frequent across most of the period and dropped with the third Reform Act. 28% think it is graph B, 18% think it's D, and 8% think it is A. Good. So what is the actual pattern we find in the data? This graph shows you what the actual pattern looks like. Again, on the x-axis, we have time, that is the date of the election, and on the y-axis, the number of election violent events. You can see that there are 2 lines. The dotted line is the line of the number of events recorded in the Wasserman-Jaggert's 2007 piece, which is the piece in the historical literature that has attempted to create a systematic data set in 2007 at a time when there were much fewer newspapers digitized. And the upper line that goes across the whole period is the data that we have collected. You can see that pattern B clearly comes nearest to this pattern. There are like 3 periods that you can observe here. In the first period, roughly from 1832 to the early 1860s, we have about 90 events per election on average. Then we see a sharp increase up to the Second Reform Act and the election immediate thereafter. So between 1865 and 1885, we have much more violent elections, with roughly around 300 violent events in the election. And then from 1886 to 1910, it drops again. And in that period, we have roughly the same number, around 80 events per election that we had before. You can see that in no election in the 19th century was there no violence at all. The most peaceful election being the election of 1901 in this period. Election violence also was associated with injuries of various sorts, and deaths were not uncommon. Overall, in our data, we find 93 different deaths, and you can see that the shape roughly goes along with the number of events. There are quite frequent number of deaths early in the period, and then it drops down later in the period. 1832 was particularly deadly, as was 1868. In 1832, a large spike comes from the intervention of the military in the 1832 Sheffield election riot, which led to 5 people dying in a single event. The election with the least dead, or no deaths, no fatality, was 1859. So what about the spread of election violence? We have now talked about what the temporal pattern looks like, and that it was quite frequent, prevalent, and occurred in every single election in the 19th century. But how widely spread was it? Was it mostly concentrated in industrial cities of the north? Was it concentrated in rural areas of the south, mostly a Welsh phenomenon, widespread throughout England and Wales, or something that, you don't know or don't want to give an answer? So if we could have the second poll, please. If I could ask you to please indicate what you think is the right answer here, and click submit. Thank you. Can we have the results? Good. 59% think it was widespread. 38% think it was concentrated in the industrial cities of the north. Very few think it's a Welsh phenomenon. And a minority of 3% think that it is mostly concentrated in the rural areas of the south. So this is the map showing all of the events, ranging from election riots to individual incidences of assaults and property damage throughout the period. As you can see, it is very widespread, and there is no clear geographical pattern. Almost everywhere where people lived in the 19th century do we see election violence events. You can see that in the rural areas in the west and northwest of Wales, you have fewer events, as well as in the northeast, where the Pennines are. But from Cornwall all the way to Norfolk, and from Brighton or the Isle of Wight all the way up to Northumberland, there are election violence events. So another way to look at this is to look at the proportion of constituencies that were affected in each year. And again, we see a very similar trend as we saw before when we looked at the raw number of events. And you can see that roughly 25% of all constituencies between 1832 and 1865 were affected by violence. It then jumps, as with the number of events, and roughly 45% of all constituencies were affected. It drops steeply in terms of spread, so that we get to roughly 15% of all constituencies experiencing at least one election violence event after the Third Reform Act. So our final poll is the question of which county experienced the most election riots. Election riots being the largest event involving often hundreds and thousands of people rioting during election time, be it during a campaign, on polling day, or immediately thereafter. Could we have that poll, please? Can I ask people on Zoom to please post their choice? Thank you. Can we see the results? So most people, 59%, think Lancashire, 37% think Staffordshire, and as per seen on the map, the counties of in Wales were not chosen. So closing this poll, the top three counties in terms of election violence are election riots are Lancashire, West Riding, and Staffordshire. Yes, those are all mostly in the north, but there was election riots throughout the country, and the next 4, 5, and 6, I think, are all counties in the west and in the south of England. The most violent county overall in the number of events is Lancashire, where we've recorded over 189 events throughout the period. There are also counties at the bottom. You can see the 13 counties listed here, which did not have a single election riot during this period. Most of them are very rural and therefore did not have a high number of density, but all of them experienced individual incidences and some property damages around elections. The least violent county of all was Pembrokeshire, where there were only 2 incidences, one a property damage and the other one a debated case of whether a candidate was actually attacked or whether the candidate just claimed to have been attacked. So what forms did election violence take? Election violence often did not involve actual weapons in the sense that we think of weapons, but ad hoc things like fists, sticks, missiles of various sorts, like stones, rotten vegetables, eggs, and also dead animals. This suggests that election violence was generally something spontaneous that happened often unplanned. Stones were picked up from the street, dug up. In Chippenham in 1865, rioters went to the graveyard to split up gravestones to use them as weapons, and dead animals were partly used to also protest the voting on the Nighttime Poaching Act, which was a political issue at the time. Weapons that were used were mostly bludgeons, especially among hired roughs and rioters that I will talk about in a second, which used life preservers, which you can see an image of on the right, the smaller of the two. And then among police forces against rioters and onlookers, truncheons, here an exhibit from the Royal Armouries Museum with the painted with the royal arms This one is slightly earlier in the period, between 1800 and 1830, but they looked very similar during the time period we are investigating. On the side of the military, which was often brought in after reading the Riot Act early in the period, they used cutlasses, swords, bayonets, rifles, and muskets. Here, 3 exhibits from the Royal Armories. The sword actually is a police sword, not from military, and from a slightly earlier period, that is 1821 to 1829. But they looked very similar in terms of size that were used by the cavalry. The bayonets, the musket with the bayonet is from 1874, and the musket at the bottom is from 1847, and were of the kind used to break up riots throughout the period. So what are the main 3 types of election violence, and what are their causes? Election violence itself is a complicated phenomenon with overlapping and interconnected causes differing along various lines. While looking through all of our events, most of them fall within one of the following three types. The first type sees election violence as a byproduct of electoral carnival. Up until 1880, elections were largely held in the open in a party-like atmosphere. It involved party banners, election posters being posted all over the town, music, marching bands, boxing matches, and other forms of entertainment. It was one of the big social events in the calendar of a town. Most importantly, it involved often free food and, most crucially, large amount of alcohol paid by candidates to treat electors, but also often local people that were hired as canvassers, etc. This often led to scenes that got out of hand as per the events that we found. For example, in 1847 in Chepstow, the arrival of a beer wagon sends the crowd into such an excitement that it results in assaults, property damage, and the death of a young surgeon. In 1865, at New Radford, 2 children were charged with assault in the aftermath of a riot, having thrown stones at people, and claiming in their defense that people told them, "Go on, there's no law at election time." Because laws at election times were not necessarily followed, especially with corruption, which throughout the period was clearly forbidden by laws from way early in the period, from the 17th and 18th century, people felt that generally election periods were a time when different rules and laws applied. But election violence was also used more sinisterly and as a campaign strategy by candidates or their agents in order to intimidate and dissuade voters from voting. They often hired so-called bullies, bludgeon men, or lambs, as they were known in Nottingham, that were brought in from outside the constituency in order to intimidate voters, both during the campaign, but also on polling day. Especially with elections being held open and people being able to observe how the election unfolds and whether a candidate is leading or lagging behind, and often polling being held over multiple days, there was ample opportunity to bring out roughs to prevent other voters from the opposition to reach the stage in order to vote. This meant that voters often had to run a gauntlet through various people shouting verbal assaults, throwing various missiles at them, making it hard for them to actually reach the stage. A really nice example of this is in 1832 in Hartford, where 3 weeks prior to the election, 40 paid bullies were moved onto the Tory mayor's land. they patrolled the town throughout that election period, attacking anyone that they thought might not be supporting a Tory candidate. The mayor held back security forces in order to not interfere. And when a liberal crowd started to retaliate, the mayor brought up security forces in order to break up the crowd. Another case where violence was used during the campaign is that led to a serious riot in Nottingham was in 1865. People were set upon and attacked the Tory hired thugs on the platform where the Liberals held a speech was set on fire. There were many serious injuries in the crowd, and at least one newspaper that we found claims that the victory of the Tories was due to this event that broke up a Liberal campaign event that was meant to mobilize Liberal voters. In 1852, we also found a report that Liverpool police closed down a protectionist party weapons factory, uncovering protectionist plans for election disruption, which shows that this was something that was premeditated, strategically planned, and where weapons were actually produced and money spent in order to influence elections. Finally, the third type of electoral violence sees violence as a popular expression of the disenfranchised. Remember that even after the Third Reform Act, only 60% of all men and no women had the right to vote. That meant roughly 70% of the population could not vote. Violence then was a form of participation, either strategic in support of a specific party or a specific candidate, or expressive to literally express a voice of dissent, also occurring in non-contested elections where not even the voters had the right to choose who would represent the constituency, and violence was used in order to protest the lack of choice. Often, this type of election violence was related to particular issues, like the Corn Laws in the 1840s, Irish Home Rules, and women's suffrage. Due to the different issues it was related, violence often took a religious component, an ethnic component, or a specific gender background. For example, in 1859 at Stamford, there was an election disturbance and the crowd exclaimed that it will never be otherwise and elections will remain violent until the franchise is extended to everyone. In that case, mostly male voters. In 1868 in Bradford, you had religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants over issues in the election, which led to the crowds rioting. And finally, in 1865 at Derby, a mob protested an election candidate's vote for the Night Poaching Act, responding to a speech held in public by pelting him with dead dogs, cats, and rabbits. The candidate had to retreat and give the speech later in a private venue in front of select supporters. So why and how did we get to the point where elections become peaceful? We can't really see the vanishing of election violence throughout this period, but we see a significant drop in the use of violence in elections right after the Third Reform Act. 1885 being the election with the most events and the most constituencies affected, then is dropped for the 1886 election and remains at a low level. Election violence, as pointed out by historians such as John Lawrence, shows that it actually only vanished after the end of World War I. We think that this drop is not something that, because it's so quickly and so radical, not something that can be explained with changes over time that occurred slowly in terms of cultural or attitudinal changes, but has to be something that is related to institutional and legal changes and organizational changes. In 1883, the Parliament passed the Corrupt and Illegal Practices Act, which constrained the use of bribery and violence, and actually for the first time created legally binding constraints on candidates. The Third Reform Act led to a change in the electoral system, moving to single-member districts and plurality voting, the way that we hold elections currently in the UK. And then finally, political parties become much more involved in elections. In the early period, political parties were mostly parties in parliament, but candidates stood independently, often also claiming to be independent while voting with a particular party in the House of Commons. They remained independent as candidates, but sometimes ran as slates for organizational reasons early in the period. After the Third Reform Act, parties become much more involved in elections. They begin to fund campaigns, campaigns begin to be organized centrally, candidates are selected by parties, and parties begin to pay reputational costs for bad behaving candidates, which provides them with incentives to constrain that sort of behavior. As mentioned at the beginning, we are in early stages. We have collected the data, which was a massive effort and took us longer than thought due to the amount of election violence that we uncovered. And we are currently working on these outputs. We are working on various papers on the causes of election violence and papers investigating empirically to what extent different institutional changes and organizational changes can actually account for this drop in violence. So some tentative concluding thoughts, which we can say at this point in our project. Election violence was much more frequent and widespread than previously known. It was regular, it occurred regular, and often resulted in serious injuries and death. There were different types of election violence. There isn't a specific single type that occurs repeatedly, but 3 different types that is associated with different causes that need to be distinguished. Understanding the causes of the decline in the late 1880s holds, I think, important policy implications for curbing election violence in developing countries today, something that is a problem and plagues countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia in particular. Roughly 25% of our elections globally held worldwide experience some form of violence even today. As I said, there's much more to come. We are working on outputs. The project is still funded until June, and we will be working further on this. So if you are interested and this has piqued your interest in the project, please visit us on our project website, follow us on our Twitter account. And if you have questions or would like to know something specific about an event or have an event that you would like to share with us, please do feel free to contact us. Our contact information is provided on the website. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And we are as well joined by Lydia. Lydia, do you mind just briefly introducing yourself for the benefit of the audience?
Yeah, sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Lydia. I've been working with Patrick and with other professors on developing a lot of this research. And in particular, I've been working on looking at how deaths changed over time, where they happened, when they happened, how they happened, those kind of things. So it'd be interesting to hear from you.
Great. And so Patrick, for the benefit of the audience, I wonder if it's worth just talking a little bit about kind of the narrative of how violence and crime changes over the course of the Victorian period and how this, this peak in electoral violence in the middle of the period might contradict that.
Yeah, so, well, I don't think that there is a single narrative that one can speak to. I think there's different narratives. There's some people that argue that violence was generally something that was accepted and widespread during the Victorian period, but kept declining as throughout the period, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
And so the pattern that we find speaks against this in the sense that, it became much more frequent in the middle period and then dropped again later on. Others kind of point out that violence was something that remained constant throughout the period, and that especially the elites were kind of acceptant of it as being, part of the game and part of life. I also think that election violence might be different from regular forms of violence, crime, assaults that happen outside of election periods. So the way that we've conceptualized election violence, and I might have mentioned this at the talk and missed it, is that election violence is considered for us to be something that is a physical damage or the implicit and immediate threat of a physical damage to persons or property directly relating to the national election cycle. So it is occurring in a narrow time window, or in the month of the election. It is related to election activities, and it has to involve some kind of physical damage to property or persons, or an immediate threat of such damage.
Yeah. And just a quick sort of methodological question out of curiosity. You mentioned, for instance, one of the candidates who claimed that they had been assaulted, but there was some skepticism about that. How did you do any verification of the reports, or is it just enough that someone, that narrative of people being attacked is being sort of communicated around election time?
No, this is actually a very good question. So newspapers at the time were highly partisan. You had liberal newspapers and conservative newspapers, and not everything that was written necessarily in a conservative newspaper was true. So, fake news, while we think of it as a new phenomenon, is something that occurred in the 19th century as well. So we had a worry about that, which is why we collected data at the event report level. And we have also collected information about the partisan leaning of these different newspapers from the Mitchell Press Directory at the time, which is a directory that was given to advertisers in order to choose which papers they could advertise in and reach a specific audience. So what we did is we then merged the Mitchell data with our data set and checked whether we had different accounts from different leading newspapers or neutral newspapers on these things. Mm-hmm. And those accounts were weighted higher than the accounts that we had in other, where we did not have, different sides speaking about the same thing. Lydia might also be able to speak to some of these things, because at the beginning of when we looked at our event reports, we had over 200 deaths, I think. And having gone through the data carefully and cleaning it, it turns out that a considerable amount, roughly 50% of them, were not actual deaths related to violence, but were accidental deaths. Or deaths that were claimed in one paper but couldn't be verified in any other paper. Is there anything more to this, Lydia?
Yeah, so definitely it was something which was a pretty significant issue. I think one of the ones that kind of stands out in my head was right at the start of the period, we had a death where a candidate was accused of inciting the death of somebody in the crowd. And in the end, when you actually dig deeper into the various different newspapers and you can read different reports of it, it kind of becomes clear that he certainly didn't incite it, and whether or not that death actually happened is incredibly questionable. So there was definitely issues and problems that came up from trying to figure out how to verify the information that you could read in one newspaper over the information available in others.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's also one reason why it took us a significant amount of time to clean and correct the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but definitely worth doing. You don't want to be repeating Victorian electioneering standards. No, I mean, the reason that this mid-Victorian peak interests me is in part because of the object that we showed as the lead up to the talk, which is it's a patent belt pistol from the late 1850s, early 1860s. Now, at that time, there was what's called the garroting scare, which was fear of people coming up behind wealthy people and strangling them, leaving them for dead, stealing their money. Now, there's been lots of articles which have debunked this and said, it's ridiculous. There's no rise in this sort of crime. We don't find it. But it's interesting that mid-Victorian period seems to be where people are feeling more insecure about crime, violence, and could be potentially tied into election stuff, that there's this atmosphere of of things are getting worse, of course, with the extension of the, well, with the potential extension of the franchise.
Yeah, so I mean, as I said at the beginning, it is an incredibly tumultuous time. I think we can't really stress this enough. I mean, there were massive changes going on societally. You know, there was technological development at a rapid speed never seen before. There were new jobs, etc. There was mass movement from you know, rural areas to cities that created all kinds of problems, etc., where the state did not have a solution for, but couldn't be resolved at the individual level, which created political demands that couldn't be voiced and weren't represented in parliament, that created frustration, etc., which, you know, led to, in part, to this one specific form of election violence, but, you know, also put wealthy elites and, of course, representatives in a position of danger.
Yeah, that sort of leads us on to a question from Martin Davies, in fact, which is, you know, we know about the authorities and the rifles, the muskets that they were able to use. How about the public using, you know, not just stones and improvised weapons, but pistols, rifles, swords? I guess this ties potentially into Lydia's information about deaths specifically.
Yeah, so Lydia would know this better than I do, because she's dug very deep in each individual of those 93 cases.
Yeah, so using, you know, any form of weapon beyond, say, a bludgeoning weapon was really unusual for the public. I think I only had around 3 recorded cases of the general public using guns in electoral violence. It was incredibly rare. And interestingly, in at least one of those cases where the general public had brought a pistol to the election and he had ended up killing another man, there was a huge amount of controversy over the fact that this man had come armed with a pistol to the election, and the idea that that kind of indicated premeditated violence and all that kind of thing. So it was incredibly unusual for those kind of weapons to be used. Pretty much the most imaginative, I'd say, that the public got with their weapons was commissioning the use of like bludgeons, of iron bludgeons, those kind of weapons. But yeah, other than that, it was generally left to the authorities and to the security forces to, you know, arm themselves more thoroughly.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the other thing I was going to sort of lead on to, the 1852 Liverpool weapons factory that was disrupted, what do we know exactly what they were making there? Was it, you know, was it clubs, was it bludgeons, was it perhaps edged weapons of some sort?
So from the newspaper article, all that could be gleaned from the 2 that reported on this was that it was bludgeons that were created, and pikes of sort.
And
so long sticks.
Yeah, which are, you know, potentially something that you could say, oh, I'm just bringing this to the election because, you know, this is something I carry normally, a walking stick or something like that. I mean, we had a question from Matt Abbott, which is, does it seem likely that violence is mostly intended to cause injury rather than fatalities, which I think is likely from what you said, but if you could speak a little bit more sort of to that.
So I don't think I've had a single case, and Lydia might correct me on this, I don't recall a single case reading that it was done in order to, you know, attack a particular person and actually kill them. Violence was used to intimidate voters. I mean, you know, if in the strategic use, it was, so in the cultural type of violence, that was, you know, expressive, unintentional, etc. I don't think people meant to kill anyone else in this. In the strategic use by candidates, I don't think candidates or agents meant to kill anyone, but it was tried to make it hard to go to the poll and vote, and try to intimidate opposing voters to stay home. There are, for example, reports where there are bands roaming the streets in the night before polling day, where, you know, that one leader leads the band and they stop at a house and say, that's a conservative voter, and everybody throws stones at the house and at the window. I don't think this is meant to kill anyone, etc. And then there are, you know, this popular expression of disenfranchisement, which I don't think that it gets to the point where people are killed explicitly or you know, targeted individually. Maybe I think there is one candidate that we had on the list if I remember correctly, Lydia can fill that in afterwards. That was try to kind of voice their dissent, concern, try to influence the outcome of the election. I mean, what did happen over the period is the electorate became much more party-oriented, and there was an increased party sentiment that got to a quite high level in the sense of like what we think of today in the US context as partisan polarization, where people literally began to hate other people and became very angry. So there is a case that we read in about a shopkeeper in London that trained his birds to verbalize assaults to anyone coming in wearing a blue rosette. And one of the customers got so angry that he assaulted the shop owner, right? Yeah, Lydia, do you want to speak to the candidate I think that was killed? Was that one targeted explicitly or an accident?
Yeah, so the candidate case was in about 1885 or something like that. And there was a real trend at the time for groups of roughs to kind of go into candidate meetings during the canvassing stage of elections and to actively intimidate people present at those meetings. So it was pretty much the only point in the overall time period that we studied where we saw considerable violence and deaths occurring at the kind of canvassing and pre-polling stage. So definitely, like Patrick said, it was really a method of participation. It was a method of intimidating the voters. In the candidate case, they didn't specifically target the candidate. He just happened to get in the way, being wrong place at the wrong time, and he did end up dying from his injuries. So yeah, it was definitely a method of intimidation more than murder.
And one thing that might tie into that as well is the likelihood of punishment. If we're thinking about, do you try and kill someone or do you just rough them up and humiliate them? How likely is it that anyone actually gets punished for something that's not a death at an election?
Well, we did find a number of event reports about legal proceedings in the aftermath of elections that involved, people rioting, destroying property, and assaulting. There's this case of the children in New Radford that I mentioned in the talk, but there are others. And interestingly, those legal proceedings are often some of the best sources we have with regard to the details of what happened and to what extent people spontaneously engaged in it, and to what extent they were actually kind of brought in from other places in order to instigate violence. They were punished. Victorian punishments were quite draconian, especially against the poorer parts of the population. The elites and candidates often got away up until the Illegal Practices and Corruption Act by kind of saying that they did not know that it was the agent, or the agent acted independent of them, etc. Only after the Illegal Practice and Corruption Act were agents actually, or were candidates made responsible for actions of agents. So that kind of massively increased accountability of candidates. To what extent that was systematic in the sense that people were held accountable regularly or not, I don't know. I think it was spotty, depending on the leaning of authorities, etc. Because we're also in a period where law enforcement only really becomes consistent and well structured over time. So very early on in the deaths, etc., where the authorities read the Riot Act and the military and police comes in, you have a massive amount of violence because the police and the military are not equipped to handle these things, and sometimes overshoot in the way that they enter or deal with the crowds. And with the establishment of the police throughout this period, and a proper trained police force that is recognizable and that is around all year, and not just during elections in terms of special constables being recruited and brought in, this becomes significantly better, and there's significantly fewer deaths involved due to police and military interventions in the second period. So after 1870s.
Yeah, and of course you compare the Martini Henry rifle that you had there, which is a weapon of the later period, with a percussion musket, and the ability of the authorities, potentially to kill someone goes up dramatically. So clearly, there's a very distinct change in approach there, that they don't want to intervene despite this peak in violence, which is really interesting. We had a question from Neil about the legacy and memory of election violence, specifically. In the later period, are people writing about past events or remembering it in sort of rose-tinted spectacles type thing? Now, how long do people remember these before a collective forgetting?
Well, it's not something I can speak very much to. We have found several newspaper reports in the digitized newspapers that spoke about like election violence, 20, 30 years back, speaking about like how now the elections are so much more peaceful. This used to be such a dangerous affair, etc. So there was a certain nostalgic element to it. And it was often used at around that period as like, we've made progress in this way. To what extent people today still recall election violence, I don't know. My experience, and this is very subjective to the people that I've spoken to throughout the years, if you aren't a 19th century historian, you don't really know how corrupt and checkered the electoral history of England and Wales and the UK in general. I mean, we, for monetary reasons, we had to focus on England and Wales, and so we left out Scotland and Ireland. But Ireland is at least as violent as England and Wales, if not more. And Scotland also has election violence incidents, as shown at the beginning of the talk through the case of Hoyt. I don't think people are aware of this. And what struck me as someone that has worked on election violence in the contemporary cases in sub-Saharan Africa, mostly for my dissertation, it is often, when you speak of people about these election violence today, somewhat of an ignorance of how it used to be in your own country, right? So, it's, well, why can't these countries just get a handle of their elections? Why do they need to use violence? This is, it's just barbaric. This is so uncivilized. I think it's a part of a process of establishing this routine of elections as a peaceable affair. And I think it's important, and it's one of the reasons why I was intrigued to study this. It's important for our understanding of democracy and how it works, especially, over the political turmoil we had in the last couple of years, that this is only something that very recently became established and something we have that is non-violent and regular.
A general question, I think, from Alan Mann on electoral culture really is the context of the chanting. What he says is that when growing up in the 1960s, he recalls a common chant that he was told goes back to the period you're analysing. Now, I can't think of anything off the top of my head specifically about chanting and songs at elections, but is this something maybe that a new big data approach might be able to look at in future?
It could be. I recall reading several newspaper articles where candidates would enter the town followed by non-electors and electors, chanting and singing certain songs, etc. So given that it was this carnival atmosphere, if you were a candidate and you wanted to mobilize the voters beyond just here's free drinks, food, and we also have these activities, you needed to kind of have an entry and a showing, and it needed to be bombastic in some way. So, I'm not surprised that this is something that, the chanting, etc., is related to that period at all.
Yeah, and as well, in an oral culture where, most people are maybe literate, but you don't tend to write a lot of stuff down, having stuff that is catchy and sticks in the brain presumably helps it, to last potentially all the way up to the 1960s, which is interesting. We had a question from Tim Hughes. So obviously, women are not enfranchised during this period, but they do participate in elections. Do we have any data, statistics, or even just anecdotes about the role of women in violence either linked to disenfranchisement or otherwise?
Yes. So, there are some women that show up at polls and actually vote in the 19th century. I don't recall the exact names, but there are like, 2 or 3 cases that we came across. The other thing that we came across is women actually, using violence in the third type that as a form of expression, keeping their husbands away from the poll because they don't like how they're voting. I remember reading an article where a woman literally kind of coped her husband, giving him massive amounts to drink and keeping him at home so that he couldn't vote. And then, of course, in the end of the period, the early 20th century, that spike in election violence in 1910 is actually largely due to the suffragette movement. So, the Black Friday is outside of the election period in 1910, but, violence after Black Friday into the election period went on into those December elections in 1910.
Yeah, and another question, another sort of big issue in the 1910s, obviously, Ireland. We had a question from Matt Abbott, is there any evidence of connection between 19th century electoral violence and Irish faction fighting of the same era?
I don't know. I don't know enough about Irish faction fighting to answer this. What I can say is that the Irish show up quite frequently in accounts, especially in riots and violence events that we have on the west coast of England and Wales, where often it is the Irish that are claimed to have started violence or started rioting on one side. And when you look at the election results, Ireland tended to vote more liberal, and those things happened to be in constituencies that had like a more sizable Tory majority. And Irish, of course, came into England as workers in, the industrial towns, etc., and so became an increasing, political force to reckon with and change the structure of these constituencies to some extent. I remember also talking to Lydia about the role of Irish with regard to election violence and deaths.
Yeah, so the Irish, there's a massive shift from around 1850s onwards, where suddenly every single death is blamed on the Irish in some way. And in particular, in kind of the late 50s or so, you see a massive rise in like anti-popery and in kind of Catholicism versus Protestantism and those kind of ideas. And there were at least a few cases where there were, Catholic processions taking place and, English Protestants attacking the Irish and those kind of things. So definitely, the Irish problem as such in the UK became really influential in violence from that point onwards.
Yeah, and so just to finish us off, we had a couple of, I guess, methodological questions from Jan. So one was that this is just the parliamentary elections, but do you have any indications of what happened at local elections? And the second is, although you're using newspapers for the sources, obviously digitization isn't the same everywhere. So how did you build that into the the methodology to make sure you were getting a fair sample of coverage?
Yes. Okay. So the first thing is we focused on parliamentary elections again due to budgetary constraints, but we did catch a bunch of local election violence. In general, local elections were less violent, and by-elections were also less violent than the general elections. I mean, that's partly, I think, the result of less being at stake. Right. I mean, the power of local officials was somewhat curtailed, as curtailed as it is today, but even more so in the 19th century. And then the other thing is that in general elections, it was about a change in government, right? And how, your vote could affect the composition of the government in Westminster. While in the by-election, it was generally about one seat. And so just as we see today that we have lower turnout in local elections and lower turnout in by-elections than we have in general elections, you see, we would expect there to be significantly fewer violent events. Also, newspapers tended to not report about local elections unless it was a really local regional newspaper. So we have way less coverage. So the problems that John spoke of, like, the coverage detail, it becomes even bigger once you get to these kind of local elections. Now, with regard to the coverage, what we did do is we checked whether we have like certain counties that have way fewer newspapers than others. And yes, there is obviously more newspapers in wealthier areas, but we don't have a single county where we don't have at least 6 or 7 different titles and at least one neutral title in terms of leaning, or at least one liberal and one conservative. So we feel fairly confident that we covered it equitably, but we don't know. Now, digitization is an ongoing effort. We stopped, recording events, etc., in the late 2019. And since then, the British National Newspaper Archive has further increased their digitization by at least another 10 million. So, there's more there that is to be discovered. We don't think that the pattern significantly changes, because the pattern is big enough, I think, to sustain over the additional titles that come up, which are now often smaller titles, less relevant and more specific to specific hobbies or specific areas. But there will be more that can be found, but we think that we've covered at least the big riots and disturbances. We're pretty sure we caught most of them, if not all. The minor incidents and individual events, there we might be a bit more sketchy on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. And I'd probably be remiss if I didn't end with at least one question about the Chartists, who I don't think we've mentioned yet, but who obviously operate exactly at the nexus of violence, weapons, and elections. So is there really no uptick in electoral violence as a result of Chartists? Do we have no instances of Chartists, bringing weapons to election or anything like that?
No, there are some incidents of Charterism in the election, especially in the 40s, 50s, etc. But you can see that from the graph, there isn't a massive uptick. So Charterism and violence, I think mostly, and this is I didn't study Charterism, so I don't know that much about this topic, happened outside of elections as well as during elections. Right, so I don't think that there is a significant peak here. So the peak is much more around 68 and 1885 than around the Chartist period.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you think of those later reform movements and you think of them as very respectable working class people, but in fact the Chartists have been unfairly maligned, and the later reform movements we've been given too much credit for. It's fascinating, but. No, thank you very much to Patrick, obviously, for coming. It's absolutely fascinating insight into Victorian life, and thank you also to Lydia for contributing to the Q&A session, and indeed to all those whose hard work in the background has made this project possible. Thank you. Okay, so unfortunately that is all that we have time for today, and in fact it's the last of our lectures before Christmas. Now, the link to the second half of the survey will be in our closing slides, but when we're done, please do go to tinyurl.com/ev-survey-2 and complete the second half of the survey, whether it's for the noble motives of contributing to the project or the mercenary motive of a chance of that £20 voucher. It's well worth doing. And if you're interested in finding out more, as Patrick said, project website is victorianelectoralviolence.uk, and the Twitter account is VictorianEV_UK. Now, before I explain what future events we've got coming up, I need to thank Robbie for producing the event behind the scenes, and to you, the audience, for taking time out of your day to attend and for all the questions you had for the speaker. And if you've got inquiries pertaining to our collection, the nature of civilian gun ownership in the 19th century, anything like that, inquiries@armories.org will get you in touch with one of our curators. Although we'll be taking a break over Christmas, we'll be returning in the new year on Thursdays rather than Wednesdays, please note. We'll kick off on the 7th of January with a lecture by our Keeper of Firearms and Artillery, Jonathan Ferguson. Jonathan's just finished a book on the British military bullpup rifle, and the lecture will explore these exotic stubby weapons and their slow and rocky road to adoption. On the 21st of January, Dr. Emma Levitt will be joining us to speak about masculine competition in the Tudor tilt yard, which played itself out in everything from armour quality and martial prowess to the impression left by the contestants' entrance. On the 18th of February, meanwhile, our conservator, Dr. Lauren Piper, will take us behind the scenes to show the elaborate preparations required to loan a stunning gold-lacquered samurai armour to another museum. For details of these and all our future events, keep an eye on our website, royalarmories.org. follow us on the social media network of your choice, and consider us following us on Eventbrite. In the meantime, thank you again for spending time with us. Have a very Merry Christmas and see you in the new year.